Hi everybody, this is the lecture to accompany Chapter 11 in your textbook. Please read Chapter 11 very carefully. There are lots of things that I simply don't have time to discuss in this lecture. Okay, let's talk about interpersonal conflict. According to the textbook, the definition of interpersonal conflict is an expressed struggle between at least two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from the other party in achieving their goals. All of these elements must be present in order for conflict to exist. So let's look at these terms in red because they actually help to define what we mean when we talk about conflict. Conflict is an expressed struggle. It's not just disagreement, it's a behavior. So you don't have a conflict with someone unless you've expressed it. In other words, unless you've made the other person aware of your feelings. So if you're just thinking inside your brain how much you disagree or don't like what somebody else is doing, that's not conflict. It's only conflict if it is somehow expressed to where the other person can perceive the conflict. And that can be either verbal or nonverbal in nature. Conflict involves interdependent parties. Parties involved have to be dependent on each other in some way. So I'm not talking about getting into an argument with someone you don't know. In order for it to be interpersonal conflict as it's discussed in the book, it has to be with somebody with whom you have some kind of relationship. It also involved perceived incompatible goals. Two goals are considered incompatible when it's impossible to satisfy both of them. And the perception exists, although it might be a false perception, that both desires can't be fulfilled. It also involves perceived scarce resources. We don't generally fight over things that we have in abundance, so people usually fight over things that they perceive as scarce. What is scarce in our lives? Well, money, time, power. Those are some of the major things that we get into conflicts over. And it also involves interference. Genuine conflict arises when each party acts in a way that the other perceives as interfering with their goals. Now, when we think about conflict, we tend to think of it on a larger scale. So like wars and all the devastation connected with them are obviously the result of global conflict. But in this class, we are concerned with personal conflict. So what are some of the ideas that are associated with conflict within personal relationships? Well, conflict is natural. Although some of us actually like it and others dislike it, we cannot be in any relationship without some kind of conflict existing. It's a normal part of our existence, and it doesn't mean there's necessarily anything wrong with the relationship. Very few relationships are conflict-free. Conflict has content and relational and procedural dimensions. Now, the content dimensions have to do with the topic of conflict, what the argument is about. Now, there's an example in the book when the dad finds out his daughter stole his credit card and used it to gamble online, and he confronts her. The topic is obviously about stealing and gambling. Then there's the relational dimensions. This has to do with the implications that the topic has for this particular relationship. So dad feels like he can no longer fully trust his daughter and that she disrespected him. She might feel like he's being too controlling. Those kinds of things come into play here. And you can argue about them, but frankly, that's not the actual issue. And then procedural dimensions, the rules. And the rules can be implicit or explicit about how conflicts ought to be handled come into play here. So the dad might prefer direct confrontation and discussion. However, the daughter may prefer to simply avoid it at all costs and just hope it all goes away. So they each have a different way of proceeding in this conflict. Conflict can be direct or indirect. When it's direct, that is open confrontation, discussing, arguing. But often conflict is indirect, and that is through use of behavior that expresses feelings without actually verbalizing them. And you probably know this as passive-aggressive behavior. Now, is one better than the other? Well, It depends. Many people in individualistic or low context cultures and societies think that direct confrontation is better. That's how we feel in America. While collectivistic or high context cultures might feel like indirect conflict is better. And that's because they want to maintain the harmony in their relationship. And so obviously each has its potential good and bad points. Conflict can be harmful. Conflict doesn't make you particularly happy, and it can actually be harmful to your well-being. Stress levels can rise. Studies have shown that actual physical harm can result. I'm not talking about hitting somebody, although that could result as well. I mean to your body. Hardening of the arteries, wounds can heal more slowly, your immune system can be affected. The physical things that could happen to your body are potentially dangerous. And as I said, it can obviously escalate, and what starts out as an argument can lead to some kind of violence. Usually the cause of this escalation is the desire by one partner to dominate the argument, and by extension, to dominate that other person. Alcohol can actually add to the possibility of aggressive behavior during conflicts. It doesn't necessarily cause conflict unless the partners are arguing over the abuse of alcohol, but it can certainly aggravate the situation. Now, all that having been said, conflict can actually be beneficial. Well-managed conflict can have positive benefits. In what ways? Well, we can learn more about each other and our relationship. We can come to a more satisfactory conclusion if we use conflict correctly than either of us could have come up with alone. We can learn to compromise, which is very important. We can become more confident of our communication skills if we walk away from a conflict having resolved it in a positive way, and we can end up feeling more satisfied within our individual relationships. Now, some conflicts will never be resolved. Although we would like to think that all conflicts have the potential to be resolved, there are simply some that never will. And sometimes you just have to agree to disagree. So what do people have conflicts over? Well, the three most common things that spouses fight over are, number one, personal criticisms. Now, those are complaints about the other's behavior that you don't particularly like. And then number two is finances. People fight over money. And number three is the division of labor, also known as chores. We argue about lots of different things: children, our employment, our in-laws, sex, and how we use our time. But we also have a lot of conflicts with other people in our lives, and who we are has a lot to do with what we argue about. First, sex and gender. Now, women in many societies, even our own, have been socialized to play nice, while men have been more socialized towards competitive and even aggressive conflict styles. Women, because of this, may be more likely to adopt indirect tactics to deal with conflict. That's the passive-aggressive behaviors. In other words, they do stuff to you, but they don't come right out and say it. And if you're a guy in a relationship, that may have happened to you once or twice. Men, however, may actually be more conflicted when it comes to dealing with an issue with a woman in their life, because they've also been socialized not to hurt women and to play nice with women in particular. And some men resolve this by doing what's called stonewalling, or withdrawing from the battle to avoid confrontation. So a common pattern that results from this is called demand withdraw. So one partner makes a demand that the topic be discussed, and the other partner withdraws and says something like, I don't want to talk about it. So usually it's the woman who starts a conflict, and the man kind of goes into his cave and he won't talk to her about it. Culture and conflict, obviously culture affects the way that we interact with each other, and certainly it affects the way that we argue. Individualistic societies value the individual over the group, so the idea that you need to stand up for yourself and disagree with others is dominant. However, collectivistic cultures value the harmony of the group over the individual, so people are more likely to avoid direct conflict and even think of it as rude. Low context cultures like direct, explicit communication, whereas high context cultures are much more subtle, trying not to embarrass themselves and others, and they generally don't directly confront other people. Online conflict is really interesting. Computer-mediated communication has what's called a disinhibition effect, and that is the tendency to say or do things in an online environment that you would not normally say or do in other environments. Now, if you just read the comment section of any blog or online article, and you'll find that they're full of absolutely horrendous and often insulting and outrageous comments. People feel as if they are free of constraints in this particular interaction, and it's a more anonymous setting, but it may not be. You can say things online in the heat of the moment that you may truly regret later. Power is a major part of the reasons that we have conflict, and power is the ability to influence or control other people or events. Conflict often involves a struggle for power between people with different power levels, like a boss and an employee or a parent and child. The conflict is over the use of power. We all have power of some sort because all of us can do certain things in certain situations. Power is context specific. There are certain kinds of power that are only relevant in certain situations. For instance, I can tell you what to do to pass this class, and if you don't do it, I have the power to fail you. However, I can't go to your house and make you do the dishes. I don't have that power. So that's an example of how power is context specific. Power is always present. There's some form of power that's always within a relationship. So relationships are either symmetrical, where both parties have generally equal power, such as a typical friendship. It might be complementary, where one person has more power than the other, such as a boss and an employee, or a parent and a child. And some relationships can change. They can start out complementary and then evolve over time into symmetrical. Power influences the way that we communicate. Depending on the kind of relationship, there are different kinds of communication patterns that might be used. And the book refers to them as one up, one down, and one across messages, so you need to look that up. But a one up message is the one that expresses dominance and control. So if you're at work and your boss says, "Hey, could you go get me a coffee?" That's a one up message. A one down message expresses submission or acceptance of the power of somebody else. So if you say, "Sure, you want cream with that?" then that is a one down message because you're accepting that particular message and saying yes. And then a one across message is a neutral message, which is neither dominant nor submissive. Power can be positive or negative. Power is not inherently good or evil. It's simply the way people use it that is positive or negative. It must be used ethically for it to be the most effective. And specifically for a relationship to work, both parties must either implicitly or explicitly agree on that power arrangement. And power and conflict influence each other. Many conflicts are simply, as I said before, struggles for power in relationships or who controls the resources within that relationship. So there are 5 different forms of power, and these powers aren't mutually exclusive. More than one of them might be used at the same time, but you do need to understand them. The first one is reward power, and that's power that comes from someone's ability to reward you for doing what they want you to do, such as a parent giving their child an allowance for doing their chores. That's kind of obvious. Now, coercive power is the opposite of that. That is the power that comes from the ability to punish, such as the parent taking away privileges from a child who didn't complete their chores. And then there's referent power, and that is power that comes from attraction or admiration for someone. We might be more inclined to comply with requests from someone we like. This is often used in celebrity endorsements. People may go out and buy that product simply because they like that person. Then we have legitimate power, and that's power that comes from a person's status or position. Policemen, judges, teachers, those kinds of people, they have legitimate rights to make you do things in accordance with their status. That's why if you are driving down the street and you see police lights in your rearview mirror, you pull over because that police officer has legitimate power and you recognize that power. And then finally, there's expert power, and that's the power that comes from the perception that the person is an expert on the topic at hand. Hopefully, I have a little bit of expert power as well, not just reward or coercive power here, but I have expert power because I know what I'm talking about, or at least you perceive that I know what I'm talking about. Now, back to gender and conflict, but conflict as it relates to power. There aren't any exclusively matriarchal societies. The power in society has largely, to this point, been dominated by men, and it looks like that might continue for at least a few more years. The structure of most societies throughout history has allowed men to control most every kind of resource and dominate politically, religiously, and economically. Women, particularly in our country, have gotten the short end historically, at least in terms of education, economic opportunity, political involvement. More women are indeed politically involved these days. However, the United States continues to lag behind other nations in terms of the percentage of female politicians and heads of state. And this may be because stereotypical femininity emphasizes traits that are the opposite of what we consider power: passiveness, submissiveness, accommodation. And unfortunately, there is the stereotype of the powerful woman, and we've talked about what we call her, who may exemplify more male stereotypes. And at this point in our society, we view a powerful woman negatively. Hopefully that will change. Stereotypical masculine roles exemplify things that we naturally associate with more power, like physical strength, control, and dominance. So the more strongly a person associates themselves with those stereotypical qualities in a relationship, the more unequal their power distribution is going to be. And of course, culture and power. And back in chapter 2, we talked about power distance. High power distance societies are ones where there's an uneven distribution of power, like the ruling class versus the lower classes. And people in these societies might view this uneven distribution as necessary, normal, or even desirable. The lower classes are expected not to question the authority or decisions of those above them. But people in low power distance societies like ours, there is, at least on the face of it, a more equal distribution of power among social groups. That's the idea. The reality might be somewhat different. In this society, we tend to think we have more power and control over our own lives than we actually do. But we have no problem speaking out against or questioning authority. Often it's our responses, our behaviors during periods of conflict that cause problems. It's not the source of the conflict itself. We tend to leave that behind and start getting personal. So it's not the amount of arguing that you do, it's how you handle it that makes a difference to the satisfaction of a relationship. And here are 4 really negative things that we have a tendency to do when we're engaging in conflict with someone. The first one is criticism. Now, criticism in and of itself isn't always bad because sometimes things that are wrong do need to be pointed out. However, it's the way that it's said that's important. When you're not criticizing a particular behavior and instead you're criticizing someone's personality or character, that tends to be rather counterproductive. Criticisms tend to be global rather than specific. And by global, I just mean you throw these generalized complaints out there like, you never listened to me, when really the issue is that you didn't answer me when I asked if my friend had called while I was gone. And so your immediate response is, oh, fine, you never listen to me anyway. That's global. You never, you always, those kinds of things. And there's a type of criticism called gunny sacking. That's when one person saves up all their little grievances and then dumps them on the other person all at once. So an argument about a particular situation comes up, then that person loudly and angrily starts to enumerate various other things that the person has done. So maybe these things are true. Maybe each one of them needs to be dealt with. But throwing them out there simply deflects from the issue at hand and makes it less likely that you're going to come up with a resolution for this particular issue that you started arguing about. The second negative thing that can come up is contempt. And contempt is very dangerous, particularly in your intimate relationships. And it involves insulting, attacking the other person's self-worth, name-calling, mockery, sarcasm, ridiculing. These are all designed to degrade the other person. And not only does it not address the issue at hand, it actually causes increased stress to both parties, and that's both mental and physical stress, and can damage a relationship. Then there's defensiveness. Now, I'm not saying that if you're being attacked, you should not attempt to defend yourself, but defensiveness is specifically denying the validity of a criticism or denying responsibility for your behaviors. Seeing yourself as a victim, where you say it's not my fault, it's not fair, or you respond to a criticism with another criticism, such as somebody says you didn't do the dishes, and you say, yeah, well, you never take the garbage out. So you're distracting them from that particular issue and throwing it back on them. Many times, not all, but many times people become defensive because they know there's some truth to the other person's criticism, but they just don't want to deal with it or accept responsibility for it. And finally, stonewalling. I talked about that before. And that is simple withdrawing from the conversation, as in, I don't want to discuss it, where people refuse to get into the conversation. And people who do this a lot tend to feel overwhelmed by the conflict and incapable of engaging in the conversation any longer. This is not to say that at some point you go, hey, can we take a time out? This is too much for me. As long as you pick it back up where you stopped later, yeah, you could take a breather if it's very intense, but just refusing to engage in it at all never gets the issue clarified or fixed. We can't escape conflict. So the best thing to do is to learn how to handle it effectively. Our options, according to the textbook, are based on two underlying dimensions: our concern for our own needs and desires, and our concern for the other party's needs and desires. So each of these strategies I'm going to talk about might work in particular situations and with particular people, but none of them is the only right way to deal with conflict. The first one is competing. If you have high concern for your own needs and low concern for the other parties, you might use this style. In this style, somebody wins and somebody loses in this scenario, but it doesn't necessarily make for a negative outcome. If you truly believe that your needs and desires outweigh the other person's, then you may decide that this is the way you want to go. However, if this is your main strategy, you're going to find yourself alone a lot because nobody wants to be argued with all the time, particularly if that other person always wants to win any argument. Then avoiding. Now, if you have low concern both for your own desires and the other person's, avoiding might be the strategy to take. It's a matter of picking your battles, and many relationships are better when some, not all, but some areas of contention are simply avoided. Yes, if you look at this issue and go, you know what, it's not a big deal to me. I don't think it's a big deal to that other person, so let's just let it go. If this is your favorite strategy, however, you and your partner probably have a lot of unresolved issues. Then there's accommodating, and that's the opposite of competing. If you have a higher concern for the other party in this particular instance than you do for your own needs, then letting the other party have their way may be your way of keeping the peace in a relationship. And so, yeah, if you think, it really doesn't matter to me and it seems to matter a lot to that person, so fine, go ahead. However, if you continually accommodate, then you're going to end up at some point feeling angry and resentful. Once again, it's a matter of picking your battles. Then there's compromising, and that involves a moderate level of concern for everyone's needs. You can see that both your needs and the other person's needs are important, but not so much that you couldn't afford to give up a little something. So you give up something and the other party gives up something, and together you find a middle ground that may not be exactly what either one of you wants, but both of you feel that you were heard and you gained something in the process. Politics used to involve a lot of this, not so much anymore, but that is one of the ways that things get done. And finally, Collaborating is where you have high concern for both parties' needs and desires. So you can see that that other person truly wants what they want, and you truly want what you want as well. So if you can collaborate, then you're going to have what's called a win-win situation in which both parties get what they want or need. Now, this last one takes more work because it's often difficult to figure out how both people can win. But in the end, it can be a very good resolution because nobody ends up giving anything up and everyone gets what they really want. I hope that I've showed you that conflict is normal, it's natural, and it can be managed very successfully if you understand the different approaches to conflict and choose the right one for the particular situation. This is the end of the lecture for Chapter 11.